Today we're going to talk about Ada King, Countess of Lovelace, a name you've probably never heard. But her contribution literally has changed the world more than almost anyone can name. She was born Augusta Ada Byron in 1815, more than 200 years ago. Now, she was quite a lady of aristocracy. She grew up in what is now London, and she grew up knowing the great names and the great minds of the time. Her father was the poet George Gordon, Lord Byron, although he left his wife, Annabella Milbank, when Ada was only 2 months old. We believe they never saw each other again. In fact, Byron left England never to return, and he died when Ada was only 8 years old. Now, let's take a moment to consider what life was like for children of the British gentry in the early 1900s. First of all, we're talking about a period before airplanes, steamships, and railroads. Also before telephones and even telegraphs. Land travel was driven by horses. Water travel was by sail. Few people even ate with a knife and fork. This was a long time ago. The sons of aristocrats were typically tutored at home in Greek and Latin and French, philosophy and rhetoric. But upon graduation, most were limited to basic arithmetic. They could barely do much more than simple addition. It was viewed as unimportant. That's what you had commoners for. Daughters were given education centering upon their anticipated role as wife, mother, and hostess. This period was early in the Industrial Revolution. Mathematics, though, was increasingly important, but calculations were almost totally by hand. One common method to shortcut complex calculations was to refer to pre-calculated tables of values. You've probably seen those in the back of older textbooks. Reference books filled with page upon page of function values, things like navigation tables, square roots, logarithms, interest rates, trig functions, and similar values. However, these books were often filled with errors introduced because they came from laborious manual calculations. And furthermore, the time required to calculate those tables was huge and expensive, since each value had to be calculated independently. Now, Lady Annabella Byron broke the traditional mold with her daughter Ada. As a child, Annabella herself had been given extensive home tutoring in mathematics. In fact, Lord Byron lovingly referred to his wife Annabella as the Princess of Parallelograms. So I guess it wasn't too surprising that she would insist that her daughter receive extensive mathematical study. This was very unusual for that place and time. Now, Ada's birthplace name was Augusta Ada Byron, Lady Byron, and she was born in Piccadilly Terrace in Middlesex, which is now inside of modern London, but at that point in time was out in the country. Her mother picked an amazing list of tutors for young Ada, including Augustus de Morgan, who was the first professor of mathematics at the University of London, and Dr. George Boole, the father of the algebra of logic. If you should ever study digital logic design or computer design, one of your studies will be Boolean logic, and one of the key theorems that you'll learn is known as De Morgan's theorem. Now, Ada was a sickly child, but she grew up interacting with a who's who of the intellectuals of her day, including Andrew Cross, Sir David Brewster, Charles Wheatstone, Michael Faraday, and even Charles Dickens. At the early age of 17, Ada's mother took her to a party. After all, she was considered eligible for marriage in that day and time at the age of 17, where she met another mathematician, Charles Babbage. Now, Babbage had raised money for his latest project, a mechanical computation device known as the difference engine. It was based purely on gears and everything else. And interestingly enough, and this will be important, you'll see that the numbers are represented discretely, not as continuum, but as discrete values. This was about as fancy as machinery could be built in 1835. Matter of fact, this was pushing the limits of what machinists could make. And it became an ultimate problem we'll talk about in a moment. So Babbage had raised money for the difference engine. His plan was to create a bigger machine using gears and chains and pulleys that could iteratively calculate the mathematical tables required for the reference books. In fact, he planned to connect his engine to a device that would actually set the type for the book pages, eliminating even the human error in the transcription from calculation to typesetting. Now, I don't know how many of you have a good understanding of the difference between analog and digital representations. In the 1830s, it was possible to do some calculations by analog processes, such as slide rules. However, Babbage's vision involved a machine that would store amounts as digital values. Remember, I showed you those actual digits. This is kind of analogous to the relationship between a traditional clock face and a digital clock. A digital clock always shows the time, 12:43 or whatever it is, jumping cleanly from minute to minute and hour to hour. But a traditional analog clock slowly moves its hands, the hands commonly pointing between the numbers. And you have to figure out what the number really means. In other words, the analog clock never shows a precise value, but slowly slides through the range of times. Well, the digital nature of the difference engine was important in two ways. First, it made creation of tables of numbers much simpler because it was always showing a number and not an approximation. But also, it eliminated ambiguity of values, a concept that's going to become very important in the future. So Ada met Babbage, a man much older and who had a fascinating idea. In fact, Babbage had a small working section of his evolving design, as I showed you. They quickly became fast friends, though there was no evidence of any romance. Over the next few years, Ada and Charles would spend many hours conversing of his ideas on the difference engine and its possible applications beyond calculation of mathematical reference book tables. The truth of the matter is, they seemed to think on the same wavelength. It was during these discussions that Charles Babbage realized that his difference engine design, though very advanced for the times, was imperfect and in some ways a dead end. With Ada's help, he realized that it was possible to use the same concepts, along with a few new ones, to produce a full analytical engine, a purely mechanical, decimal-based computer. And I really mean computer in the same way you think of computers today. Programmable and fast, at least for that day and time, extensible, and really general purpose. The general purpose part came from Ada. She realized that the engine would hold discrete values, values without ambiguity, and that since it was programmable, it could follow any sequence of operations on those discrete values. She had the brilliant, and to us obvious in hindsight, though it was truly world-changing, that a discrete number did not have to represent a value or quantity, but it could be assigned a non-numeric value such as a letter, a word, a name, a color, a sound, or a concept. Suddenly, Babbage's machine ceased to be an overgrown adding machine and became a machine capable of manipulating abstract concepts through the use of symbols linked to numbers. So now Babbage's vision could store and retrieve information, not just calculate numbers. Not bad for 1840. And this is also why Ada is often named as the first computer programmer. Now, in 1835, Ada married William, the 8th Baron King, and when William was created an earl in 1838, she became Countess of Lovelace. Now, few people could understand Babbage's ideas. He was considered crazy by some, confusing by most. In his fact, his ideas were substantially more advanced than the available technology. As I talked about before, these designs were very complex and demanding to make mechanical devices, making his designs just beyond the reach of what machine makers of the day could make. But one Italian engineer, Luigi Menabrea, spent enough time with Babbage to understand the analytical engine's ideas, and he published a detailed analysis and explanation in French in 1843. Ada, at Babbage's request, translated the article to English, but she couldn't leave it there. She enlarged and magnified the contents. more than tripling it in size, explaining and demonstrating key concepts Menabrea had left out. Her notes included what is considered the first true computer program as an example. This seminal article can be viewed as the first time the entire vision of modern computing was written down in a single place. From contemporary writings and discussions, it's very clear that Ada saw the future of the engine more completely and more powerfully than even Babbage himself. Let me show you an idea of what it would actually look like for a fully built difference engine, because they actually built one, and it is on demonstration at the Computer History Museum here in Silicon Valley. This is what the difference engine was, not the analytical engine, not the big one. This is his original idea. And when it was made from his plans a few years ago, they put it together and it works completely and correctly and can do calculations, many calculations per second. You start with the crank on the left-hand side and keep turning, and you'll actually be able to get results on the other side. But for your purposes, this is only slightly more than a programmable hand calculator. Matter of fact, in some ways, it's not even that. An image of what the real difference engine would look like, the analytical engine would look like, is it's much larger than the difference engine. It's probably powered by steam, and you feed it with linked punch cards, and it would store and calculate values all along what was called the mill. Very, very sophisticated, and much beyond the ability of the times to create. So, a few years later, in 1852, Ada developed uterine cancer, and she died at the young age of 37. She left two sons, both named after her father, Byron and Gordon. She was buried beside her father. We really don't know what other contributions she could have made had she lived longer. Her insights completely transformed what was essentially a way to crunch numbers into something that could transform information, process it, and would ultimately give us the basis of computing that gives us the internet, the hand calculator, the cell phone, and all of the other wonderful digital items of our lives. All because of a simple idea that Charles Babbage had and was unable to implement.